You're not choosing your life. You're repeating a script you were given. The script that came as truth. The script didn't come with a warning label. It didn't arrive as a set of instructions you could read through, evaluate, and decide whether to accept. It came as something far more convincing than instructions. It came as reality, as the way things are, as the self-evident truth about what it means to be a man, what success requires, what kind of life is worth building, what emotions are acceptable, and which ones need to be handled quietly and alone. It came through the family that raised you, not through what they said explicitly, but through what they rewarded and what they punished, what they celebrated and what made the room go silent. Through the way the men around you moved through the world, what they pursued and what they avoided, what they treated as strength and what they treated as weakness. Through the culture that surrounded you before you had the vocabulary to examine it, the unspoken definitions of value, of masculinity, of what a life well lived was supposed to look like. And you absorbed it. Not passively, not blindly, but the way every human being absorbs the framework of meaning they're born into, which is to say, completely, and without the option of doing otherwise. You were shaped by it before you were capable of questioning it. By the time you had the intellectual tools to examine what you believed, the beliefs were already operational, already producing choices, already filtering what felt possible and what felt out of reach, already defining the horizon of what a life like yours was supposed to contain. Here is what makes this particularly difficult to see from the inside. The script doesn't feel like a script. It feels like reality. It feels like the natural order of things, the obvious way a serious man thinks about his responsibilities, his ambitions, his place in the world. The framework is invisible precisely because it's everywhere. Like the air inside a room, you don't notice it until someone opens a window and you feel for the first time the difference between what was in there and what was outside. This is not a story about damage, it's not about blame. Every human being inherits a script. That's not the problem. The problem is something more specific and more invisible than inheritance itself. It's what happens when you stop being able to distinguish between the script you were given and the person you actually are. When the framework becomes so familiar, so internalized, so thoroughly yours, that it stops feeling like a framework and starts feeling like identity. When the map becomes the territory, you've been making choices for years, real choices with real consequences that shaped a real life. But how many of those choices were made from a place of genuine examination? How many of them were expressions of something you actually chose, values you tested, priorities you arrived at through reflection, directions you selected after honestly comparing alternatives, and how many were simply the natural output of a system that was installed before you knew you were being installed? That question is not meant to destabilize everything you've built. It's meant to open something, because a man who cannot distinguish between what he chose and what he inherited is not free. Not in any meaningful sense. He is executing a program. Skillfully, perhaps, successfully by many external measures, but executing it nonetheless. Moving through a life whose parameters were set before he arrived, toward destinations that were defined before he had the chance to define his own. The first step is not to reject the script, it's to read it, to develop enough distance from it, enough honest attention to see it clearly for the first time, to know what's actually in it. Because you cannot revise what you cannot see, and you cannot choose what you don't yet know was ever a choice. That is where everything begins. How the script gets written. No one sits down and writes this script deliberately. That's what makes it so difficult to see. There was no moment of imposition, no conscious transfer of ideology, no point where someone looked at you and said, "Here is the framework you will live by." It assembled itself gradually, out of thousands of small moments, each one individually unremarkable, collectively decisive. The script was never written in a single sitting. It was written the way water shapes stone, slowly, invisibly, through the accumulated pressure of ordinary repetition. It was written in the specific way your father handled, or didn't handle, difficulty. In the emotional temperature of your household when something went wrong, in what got praised and what got ignored, what produced connection and what produced withdrawal, in the particular version of masculinity that surrounded you, what the men in your life treated as admirable, what they treated as weak, what they never discussed because some things simply weren't discussed. Not because they were hiding something, because the script they were living didn't have a category for it. It was written in how money was talked about, or wasn't, in the specific texture of anxiety that appeared when security felt threatened, in whether vulnerability was met with comfort or with silence, in the unspoken rules about what a man in this family, in this culture, in this particular corner of the world was supposed to want, supposed to feel, supposed to never admit to feeling. Every one of these moments contributed a line, and by the time you were old enough to read what had been written, you were already living by it. It was written, too, by the experiences that taught you what was safe to want and what wasn't. Every moment where a certain kind of openness produced a certain kind of consequence, where reaching for something was met with dismissal, or where showing uncertainty was met with impatience. The script learned from these moments. It updated. It calibrated your sense of what was realistic, what was deserved, what people like you were allowed to pursue. The script isn't made of grand events. It's made of accumulation, the slow, consistent pressure of 1,000 ordinary moments, shaping what feels natural and what feels foreign. And here is the part that requires the most honesty. Rebellion is not the same as freedom. The man who looked at the script he was given and decided to do the opposite, to live differently from his father, to reject the values of his upbringing, to define himself in explicit opposition to what he was handed, is still letting the original script write his life. He has simply inverted it. His choices are still organized around it, still in reaction to it, still defined by reference to something he never chose. The axis of his life runs through the same point, just in the opposite direction. The man who became everything his father was, and the man who became everything his father wasn't, are both living in the same script. One is following it, the other is fleeing it. Neither has examined it. True autonomy is not reaction, it's not rebellion, and it's not compliance. It's something more demanding than either, the willingness to examine the script directly, without the distortion that comes from either defending it or opposing it, and to make a genuine assessment. Which parts of this are actually mine? Which parts of what I've been living correspond to something I would choose if I were choosing freely, and which parts are simply the residue of a framework I never agreed to inhabit? Marcus Aurelius understood this with unusual precision for a man who sat at the center of the most powerful cultural script in the ancient world. The Roman ideal, strength, expansion, dominance, emotional control as a form of superiority, was the water he swam in from birth. Every institution around him confirmed it. Every expectation his position carried reinforced it. And still he wrote in private night after night about the discipline of examining what he had been taught to value versus what actually held up under honest scrutiny. He was not rebelling against Rome. He was reading the script carefully enough to know which parts of it he could stand behind, and which parts were simply inherited noise that he had been mistaking, without examination, for wisdom. That distinction between what you've examined and what you've simply inherited is where the real work begins. Jung and the mask you forgot you were wearing. Carl Jung called it the persona. The word comes from the Latin term for the masks worn by actors in ancient theater, the physical object held in front of the face to signal to the audience which character was speaking. Jung borrowed it deliberately because what he was describing was exactly that, a mask, a constructed identity assembled from the outside in, built to meet the expectations of the social world, designed to present a coherent and acceptable face to the people and environments that mattered most. The persona is not pathological. Jung was clear about this, and it's important to understand before anything else. Every human being develops one. It's a necessary part of functioning in a social world that has requirements, roles, and expectations. You need a professional face, a social face, a way of presenting yourself that is legible to others and adapted to the contexts you move through. A father presents himself one way to his children. A man presents himself differently to his employer, his friends, his parents. This flexibility is not dishonesty. It's social intelligence. The capacity to modulate how you show up in different contexts is a skill, one that took years to develop, and that serves real functions in your daily life. The problem is not the mask. The problem is what happens when the mask stays on too long. When the persona is worn consistently enough, when it's rewarded reliably enough, when the identity it presents is confirmed by enough external validation, the man underneath it begins to lose track of where the mask ends and where he begins. The distance between the constructed identity and the actual self doesn't disappear, but it becomes inaccessible. He stops experiencing the persona as something he wears and starts experiencing it as something he is. And at that point, something important has been lost. Not destroyed, not gone permanently, but buried under layers of performance that have accumulated so gradually that he stopped noticing they were performance at all. Jung wrote that one of the most common sources of psychological crisis in midlife, and the men who came to him were overwhelmingly men in their late 30s and 40s, was precisely this: the moment when a man who had successfully built and inhabited a persona began to feel, without being able to explain why, that something essential was missing. Not that his life had failed. Often his life had succeeded by every external measure. Career established, family built, responsibilities met. The observable evidence said, "This man is doing well." But the man inside the evidence felt, quietly and persistently, that the person living that successful life was somehow not fully him. That he was watching his own life from a slight distance, present enough to function, not present enough to feel it completely. The script you were given became the persona you built. The definitions of masculinity, success, and value that were installed before you could examine them became the identity you presented to the world. And the persona you built became so familiar, so functional, so thoroughly rewarded by the people and systems around you that you stopped questioning whether it was actually yours. You defended it, you invested in it, you organized your entire sense of self-worth around it. You experienced attacks on it as attacks on you, because the distinction between the mask and the man had collapsed so completely that defending one felt identical to defending the other. And you did all of this without ever being fully conscious that there was something underneath it, something older and quieter and more specific than the identity you'd assembled from other people's expectations, that had been waiting patiently for the kind of honest attention it had never quite received. This is not a crisis, it's a recognition. And recognition, as both Jung and the Stoics understood, is always the beginning of something real, not the end of what you built, but the first honest look at what it was built on, and whether the foundation is actually yours. The moment the script stops fitting, there is a specific kind of discomfort that doesn't have an obvious cause. Not the discomfort of failure, that one is legible. You can point to what went wrong, identify what needs to change, build a plan to address it. The architecture of failure is painful, but it's navigable, not the discomfort of loss, which has a shape and a timeline and the particular weight of something that was present and is now gone. This is different, quieter, more disorienting precisely because it arrives not in the middle of things going wrong, but in the middle of things going right. This is the discomfort of success that doesn't land the way it was supposed to, of achieving exactly what the script said you should achieve, and feeling in the aftermath a strange and inexplicable distance between what you have and what you expected to feel about it. a promotion that was supposed to matter more than it does, a financial milestone that produces relief, but not the deeper satisfaction that was implied in the pursuit of it. A version of your life that looks from the outside like exactly what you were working toward, and that feels from the inside like it belongs to someone who is almost you, but not quite. Not wrong exactly, just slightly off. Like wearing clothes that fit well enough but weren't cut for your specific measurements. It starts as a background signal. Easy to explain away. You're tired, you're under pressure. You need a vacation, a better routine, a new goal to pursue. So you explain it away and move forward. And the signal remains, not louder exactly, just more persistent. Showing up in moments you didn't expect. In the middle of a conversation that should feel meaningful. In the quiet that follows a success you worked toward for years. In the Sunday afternoon stillness when nothing is wrong and everything feels slightly hollow. Most men, when they encounter this feeling, do the logical thing. They double down. They assume the problem is execution, not direction. That they need to work harder, perform better, push further along the same axis. Because the script has always said that the solution to not having enough is more achievement, more validation, more evidence that the identity you've built is worth the investment you've made in it. The framework doesn't have a category for the possibility that the direction itself is the problem. So it offers the only solution it knows: increase the effort, refine the performance, produce more of what already isn't working. So you produce more, and the distance remains. Marcus Aurelius returned to this pattern throughout the Meditations with a precision that suggests he was writing from direct personal experience, not abstract observation. He described the particular exhaustion of men who had organized their entire existence around external markers, reputation, position, the approval of people whose approval they had been taught to value, and who discovered, usually far later than they should have, that those markers produced a kind of recognition that never quite reached the part of them that actually needed to be seen. The applause arrived, the confirmation arrived, and something underneath it remained untouched, unsatisfied, still waiting for something the external world was structurally incapable of providing. He wrote that a man who does not know what he is actually working toward will find that no amount of work ever feels like enough. Not because he isn't working hard enough, not because his discipline is insufficient or his ambition is misdirected in the conventional sense, but because the destination he's moving toward was defined by a framework he never examined. And something in him knows this, even when his conscious mind refuses to look at it directly. The script stops fitting not with a dramatic break. It stops fitting gradually, through the slow accumulation of moments where the promised satisfaction doesn't arrive, where the reward the framework said would make it worth it turns out to produce something real but somehow beside the point. And that feeling, subtle, persistent, genuinely difficult to articulate to anyone who hasn't felt it, is not a sign that something has gone wrong with you. It's the first honest signal that something is ready to be examined, that the script has reached the limits of what it can deliver, and that what comes next cannot be found by going further in the same direction. Why more effort makes it worse. There is a form of exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix. You know what ordinary tiredness feels like. The kind that comes from sustained effort, from long weeks, from the physical and mental cost of doing difficult things consistently over time. That tiredness responds to rest. You step back, recover, return. The capacity replenishes. The motivation comes back. The work feels meaningful again. That is the normal cycle of depletion and recovery that a man who is working hard and working in the right direction experiences throughout his life. But this other kind of exhaustion is different. You rest and it remains. You take the vacation, disconnect from work, sleep well for 2 weeks, and come back to find the weight exactly where you left it. You complete the project you've been carrying for months, reach the milestone you told yourself would feel like arrival, and the relief lasts a few days before the familiar flatness returns. Because it was never about the effort, it was always about the direction. And rest doesn't change direction. When a man is executing a script that isn't genuinely his, pursuing a version of success that was defined by someone else's framework, performing an identity assembled from external requirements rather than internal clarity, the effort itself becomes the primary source of depletion. Not because he's working too hard in absolute terms, but because the energy he's generating is moving in a direction that doesn't correspond to anything he actually chose. Every unit of effort that goes out returns less meaning than the one before it. And that gap between the energy invested and the meaning returned grows wider with every year he continues without examining the direction. This is the specific cruelty of an inherited script that functions well on external terms. It keeps producing the rewards it promised, the recognition, the stability, the markers of a life going according to plan. And every time those rewards arrive, they create just enough confirmation to delay the examination another season, another year, another decade. The script is working after all. The numbers are right, the milestones are being hit. The people around you are satisfied with the version of you that the script produces. The evidence by every conventional measure says, continue. But the evidence was never measuring the right thing. Jung described this tension as the difference between adaptation and individuation, two modes of living that look similar from the outside, but produce entirely different internal experiences over time. Adaptation is the capacity to perform effectively within an inherited framework, to wear the persona skillfully, to meet the expectations of the social world, produce the outcomes the script defines as success, and be recognized for doing so. Adaptation is what the first half of a man's life typically demands, and most men who are functional, responsible, and professionally successful have mastered it completely. Individuation is something else entirely. It's the gradual, often uncomfortable, frequently disorienting process of discovering what is actually yours, what you actually value when the external rewards are removed from the equation, what actually satisfies at a level deeper than recognition and performance. What kind of life you would build if you were building from the inside out, rather than from the outside in, from your own examined values, rather than from a framework inherited before you had the capacity to examine anything. Most men spend the first half of their lives mastering adaptation. The script rewards this. The world rewards this. The people around them reward this. And then, at some point, usually somewhere in the territory between 35 and 45, though the timing varies, the returns begin to diminish in a way that can no longer be explained away. Not because the adaptation stops working externally, but because something internal starts demanding a different kind of attention, something that more effort in the same direction cannot satisfy, something that more performance of the same identity cannot reach. Jung called this the call toward individuation, and he was precise about what it felt like from the inside. Not a dramatic crisis, not a sudden collapse of meaning, but a slow and growing sense that the life you've been living, as functional and as successful as it may appear, has been organized around a center that was never quite yours. That the man performing the role and the man inside the performance have been quietly diverging for years. And that the exhaustion you feel is not the exhaustion of a man who has worked too hard. It's the exhaustion of a man who has worked hard in a direction that was decided before he arrived. You are not tired because your capacity is insufficient. You are not tired because you need more discipline, more motivation, more commitment to the path you're on. You are tired because the work has been pointing somewhere that was never actually yours to arrive at. And the only thing that resolves that specific exhaustion is not more effort. It is not better execution of the same script. It is a different question entirely, one that most men avoid for years because it feels more destabilizing than any amount of hard work. The question is not, how do I do this better? The question is this actually mine? What Marcus Aurelius kept examining. Every night alone, Marcus Aurelius wrote against the script, not dramatically, not in the language of revolution or self-reinvention, in the quiet, methodical, almost reluctant language of a man doing the daily work of examining what he had inherited and testing it, carefully, honestly, without the comfort of a predetermined conclusion, against what he actually believed when no one was watching. The Meditations were never intended to be read by anyone else. This matters more than most people realize when they encounter the text. These were not essays written for posterity, not philosophical treatises designed to persuade. They were private notes, written to himself in the middle of military campaigns in the margins of an impossibly demanding life, returning again and again to the same essential practice, taking what seemed obvious, what seemed natural, what seemed simply true about how a man in his position should think and act and value, and asking whether it actually held up under honest scrutiny. Not whether it was accepted, not whether it was traditional, whether it was actually true. He had every reason not to do this work. He was Emperor of Rome, the most powerful position a human being could occupy in the ancient world. The script he had inherited was the most authoritative cultural narrative in existence, a framework that defined greatness in terms of military expansion, political dominance, the accumulation of legacy across generations, the suppression of anything that looked like weakness. Every institution around him confirmed this script. Every tradition he had been raised inside reinforced it. Every expectation his position carried said in 1,000 different ways, "This is what matters. This is what a life like yours is supposed to produce. This is who you are supposed to be." And still he wrote in private about the vanity of reputation, about how quickly the names of even the most celebrated men dissolve into the indifference of time, how the emperors before him, whose legacies seemed permanent, were already forgotten by most of the people living under his rule, about how the approval of others, including the approval of people he genuinely respected and whose opinions he valued, was not a reliable guide to whether an action was actually worth taking. About the discipline of returning daily to the question of what was actually good rather than what was conventionally valued. He wrote about the seductiveness of external recognition, how easy it was, even for a man who knew better, to begin organizing his choices around what would be praised rather than what was right. He wrote about the specific danger of inheriting a powerful identity, how the Stoic emperor, the philosopher king, the man of perfect rational control, was itself a role that could become a script, a persona worn so consistently that the man underneath it stopped being accessible even to himself. He was not only examining Rome's script, he was examining his own, the particular version of it that his position, his training, and his temperament had assembled around him. This is what the Stoics called philosophy as practice, not as a system of ideas to be mastered intellectually and then applied from a safe distance, but as a daily discipline of examination that never finishes and never produces final certainty. The examined life for Marcus Aurelius was not a destination to be reached. It was a commitment to be renewed every day, a willingness to return regularly and without defensiveness to the question of whether what he was doing corresponded to what he actually believed, or whether he had simply been carried forward by the momentum of a life whose script was so large and so well established that it moved everything in its vicinity without anyone having to push. That discipline is available to any man, not in the grand terms of governing an empire, but in the specific and immediate terms of a life being lived right now, with its particular inherited assumptions about what success means, what a man is supposed to want, what kind of achievement justifies the cost it requires, what emotions are acceptable, and which ones need to be managed in silence. The scale is different. The practice is identical. The examination doesn't require certainty about what you'll find. It doesn't require having the answers before you begin. It only requires the willingness to look and the honesty to stay with what you find long enough for it to actually tell you something. Reading your own script for the first time. This is not about burning down what you've built. That needs to be said clearly, before anything else, because the moment a man begins to examine the script he's been living, there is a natural fear that examination means rejection. That looking honestly at what was inherited requires dismantling what was constructed from it. That questioning the framework means losing the life. It doesn't. What you've built is real. The relationships, the work, the hard-earned capacity to function in the world, none of that disappears because you begin to read it more honestly. What changes is the relationship between you and it. The difference between a man who is living a script unconsciously and a man who has read it carefully is not necessarily visible from the outside. It may not change the broad contours of his life at all. What it changes is the quality of presence inside that life, the difference between executing a role and actually inhabiting a choice, between doing what the framework requires and doing what you have examined, tested, and decided is genuinely yours. Reading your own script for the first time is a specific practice. It begins with a particular kind of attention, not the attention you bring to solving problems, which is forward-looking and instrumental, but the attention you bring to understanding something, which requires slowing down enough to see what's actually there. It starts with the questions that feel most obvious, and therefore most rarely asked. What do I believe success looks like? And where did that definition come from? What do I treat as evidence of my own value? And who taught me to use that specific evidence? What kind of man do I believe I'm supposed to be? And is that belief something I arrived at, or something I absorbed before I knew I was absorbing it? What do I consistently pursue that, when I'm honest, doesn't actually satisfy? And what does that pattern tell me about the distance between the script's promises and my own reality? These are not comfortable questions. They are not meant to be. Jung wrote that the most important work a man can do in the second half of his life is precisely this, not the work of adaptation and performance that dominated the first half, but the work of individuation, of gradually, honestly, sometimes painfully distinguishing what is actually his from what was placed in him by a world that needed him to be a particular kind of person before he had any say in the matter. Marcus Aurelius did this work every night for years, and he never treated it as finished. That is the most important thing to understand about this practice. It is not a problem to be solved once. It is a relationship to be maintained. A commitment to returning regularly to the question of whether what you are doing corresponds to what you actually believe, or whether you have simply been carried forward by the momentum of a life that was already in motion before you fully woke up inside it. You are not starting from zero. You are starting from here, from a life that already exists with everything it contains, including the parts that were chosen and the parts that were inherited. The work is not to replace it. The work is to read it, to see perhaps for the first time with real clarity which parts were written by you and which parts were written for you. And then, not all at once, not dramatically, but in the ordinary moments of an ordinary life, to begin writing the next part yourself. That is not a small thing. That is the most important thing. Sei du Archeiger. And if you made it this far, if something in this video landed in a place that usually stays quiet in the middle of everything that needs your attention, if this perspective brought some clarity to your silence, consider subscribing to the channel to join our community and leave your comment below. I read them. Every single one, because more often than not, the next topic comes from there, from the experiences you share, from the kind of pain that almost no one manages to put into words. And in the end, maybe the most important thing about this channel is simply the recognition that you are not the only one carrying this kind of silence. Thank you for your presence, for your attention, and for the time you chose to spend here today. See you in the next one.